Everybody, Jake Reynolds here with Functionize Health and Physical Therapy and physical therapist at Druid Hills Golf Club. Welcome to your week 1 virtual challenge mobility and stretch session. Today I'm going to take you through a handful of stretches for hip, lumbar, and shoulder mobility and muscle lengthening techniques. So follow along with me. We're going to hold each stretch for about 30 seconds to a minute. You can either watch the video in full or you can kind of follow along as I do this. Feel free to pause the video as we go through to make sure that the techniques are correct and that you're getting the intended benefit. So the first one we're going to do is a hip flexor stretch. Oftentimes we see people do this stretch in a variety of different ways, but I like to be really specific about the way we do hip flexor stretching so that we get the max amount of benefit from that exercise. You've probably seen this stretch done in a kneeling position where you kind of lean forward, call that a sprinter stretch. What oftentimes happens there is we don't actually stretch out the hip flexor in the most intended way, in that we go into hip and lumbar extension and not actually tightening the hip flexor. This stretch must be done with a flat back and a tucked pelvis to get the most amount out of that stretch. So what you're going to do is you're going to get on the ground, have a box or a couch or something behind you, and a pad on the ground for your knee. You're going to place your knee on the pad and your foot up on the couch or the box with your other foot in front of you. From that position, if my back is arched like this, you're going to work on flattening out your spine and tucking your hips underneath you. When you do that, you're going to really stretch out the hip flexor on the knee, on the side that the knee is down. Gently push your foot down into the box behind you, staying tall through that movement. We're going to stay here for about 30 seconds. So hip flexors are muscles that attach from your spine to your thigh. That would be called your psoas. Your other hip flexor is going to be your quad muscle that attaches from your kneecap up to your pelvis. So you have 2 hip flexor muscles. Psoas is the one that we're targeting here through tucking the hips. You're going to target the quad by putting your foot up on a box behind you. Hold that position for another 10 seconds. If you want to, you can add in a side bend stretch with the arm of the same side that you're stretching with a little bit of rotation. That's going to stretch that hip flexor out even a little bit more. Hold it for 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and relax. And we're going to switch legs. Same thing. Place your foot up on the box, drop the knee down to the ground, stay tall. Make sure you tuck your hips like you're trying to flatten your back and tuck your buttocks behind you. In that position, gently push the foot down into the box behind you and feel the stretch along the quad and the pelvis of that hip that is down. Again, in that position, we're going to take the other arm and you're going to side bend and gently rotate. Doesn't need to be a ton of movement. Hold that position for another 30 seconds. Stretching the hip flexors and quad out is good for people who sit a lot. If you spend more than an hour or 2 a day sitting, you should be stretching your hip flexors a few times per week. If we can't stretch the hip flexors, you're going to be stuck in what's called an anterior pelvic tilt, which is not great in terms of athletic performance. We need to be able to anterior tilt, but we also need to be able to posteriorly tilt, which is what we're doing in this tucked position, which is why your hip flexor will be stretched in a posterior tilt. Okay, slowly come out of that hip flexor stretch. Our next stretch, we're going to do what's called a shin box. You're going to get on the ground, one leg out in front of you, foot facing forward, back leg behind you with the foot facing out. Stay tall through your chest, keep those toes facing forward. We're going to, in that, we call this a shin box position. In that shin box position, we're going to fold forward. Hands kind of in front of you there, folding your chest forward. Think about keeping the chest and head up. Make sure we're not tucking down. Keep the head and chest up and push down into the ground. You should feel a stretch on the outside of the hip that is in front of you, on the outside of that glute muscle of the foot that is in front of you. Hold there for another 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Next, do not change your leg position. Walk your hands behind you and lean back and gently push your hips up toward the ceiling. When we do this, we're stretching the opposite leg into internal rotation. You should feel a stretch on the front outside portion of your thigh and all the way down into the top of the quad muscle. Hold that position for another 20 seconds or so. If you are an athlete of any sort, hip internal, external rotation, especially for golf and tennis, is extremely important. When you're posted up on one leg and you rotate around that leg, you need hip rotation to actually use the glutes. Otherwise, you're going to get that rotation from the knee or from the lumbar spine, which are segments that are not generally meant to rotate very much. You want to be able to get your rotation from your hips. And bring it back forward. Next, switch legs. Bring the opposite leg that was behind you in front of you. Bring the front leg behind you. Again, about a 90-degree bend through this leg to match up with the shin on the other leg. Then we're going to work on folding forward again, pushing through, stretching the outside of that front side hip. Hold that position for about 30 seconds or so. Again, hip internal, external rotation is extremely important, especially as we age. One thing we should know about our hips is that we develop hip arthritis because of a lack of movement. Joints stay healthy because they have a full range of motion. When we move our joints, they should be able to get lubrication through movement. Joints are avascular, meaning they don't get blood supply. Joints get lubrication and nutrition through movement. So using your full range of motion is important. Next, bring it back behind you, hands back. Push your chest and gently lift your hips towards the ceiling. Oftentimes, what you will see in men is a lack in internal rotation of the hip. In women, you'll often see a lack of external rotation. This is simply an attribute of the way the pelvis and the hip socket is shaped. It's not unusual to see men be more out-toed and women be more in-toed. That will often impact the angle of your knee and also the angle of the foot. So as you do these stretches, don't be surprised if you get more stretch in one direction versus the others. That is not uncommon. Hold here for another 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Relax. Next, we're going to move into what's called an iron cross. This is a hip lumbar rotation exercise. Iron cross, you're going to be on the ground, arms straight out behind you in a cross position, or arms straight out to the side in a cross position. You're going to lift one leg up, rotate it, drop it to the side, touch the ground, bring it back up, drop it down, and then switch legs. Rotate, drop, bring it back up, and switch. Let's get 5 in each direction. That was 1. Control that rotation. Bring it back up, and switch legs. Control your rotation, tap, bring it back up. That's 2. Lift, pull that foot up with you, reach it up as high and as far as you can, touch, bring it back up, and switch legs. Same thing, rotate, control the rotation, bring it back up. That's 3. Try to keep your shoulders and hands flat to the ground, rotating through the lumbar spine through this movement. Drop it back down and switch legs. And rotate, back up. That's 4. And last one on each side. Control your rotation, tap, back up, and switch legs. Last one. And that's 5. That is your lumbar spine iron cross exercise. Lastly, we're going to do some shoulder stretching. We're gonna start with an internal rotation sleeper stretch. Get on your mat, lie on your side, hips stacked. You're laying on top of your shoulder. Make sure we're not opened up, but we're perfectly stacked, shoulders one on top of the other. You'll have a 90-degree bend in your bottom side arm. Take your top hand, gently push down to the ground until you feel a gentle stretch on the back side of the shoulder. You'll feel that wrap around to a little bit to the top of the deltoid. You should not feel that radiate down into the biceps or into the forearm. Gently stretch, hold that position. This is stretching out the posterior capsule of the rotator cuff. The rotator cuff is our primary joint stabilizer for the shoulder. The external rotators tend to usually be weak. A weak muscle is often a tight muscle. So aside from just doing rotator cuff stretching, we should also always do some rotator cuff strengthening. Hold that position for another 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and switch sides. Rotator cuff tears are extremely prevalent. Rotate, hold that position, stack your shoulders, push that hand down. A rotator cuff tear is one of the most prevalent conditions, orthopedic conditions there is. Just as a rule of thumb, take your age, attach a percentage to it. That's the likelihood of a rotator cuff tear. Now, just because you have a tear doesn't mean it's going to be painful and doesn't mean it's going to restrict your function. What you need to do is focusing on getting the entire system stronger. The rotator cuff is not one muscle, it's a series of muscles. It's more than 5 muscles that make up the rotator cuff that stabilizes the shoulder joint. So just because you have compromised in one of the rotator cuff muscles does not mean that you will have issues in that arm. But we do need to make sure the rotator cuff is strong. Okay, so now we've stretched both posterior cuffs of the rotator cuff. Relax that arm. Last one, we're going to do a lat stretch in a child's pose position. What you will do, a classic child's pose position, is on hands and knees, and you work on dropping your hips down, back towards your ankles with the arms out in front of you. What I want you to do is take, if you're on a mat, take your right hand to the corner of the mat, bring your left hand across, stack it on top of the right. Drop into that child pose position and try to round out and flex your body to the right so that you open up the left side and left shoulder. Hold this position for about 30 seconds. You should not be getting hip and or back pain with this position. This should feel just like a stretch in the outside of the crossed over arm. Lean into that, hold that position, and do a few deep breaths. We're gonna hold for another 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Bring it back up, switch your arms. Left arm over, right hand stacked, drop your hips back. Hold that position. This is a good lat stretch. Again, make sure you're side bending. The lats are some of our best power muscles. The lats, if they are tight and restricted, will also limit shoulder joint function. The lats attach to the humerus, the muscle or the bone right here. What they do is they serve to extend the arm. If the lats are tight, we will have a difficult time getting our arm up overhead for a tennis serve or for an overhead press or for a golf swing. When the lats are tight, they can often be a contributor to what's called shoulder impingement. So we need to make sure we're getting a good lat stretch and or lengthening exercise on a frequent basis. Bring it back up and rest. Now, we quickly went through all of those exercises, your hip flexor stretch, your shin box hip internal and external rotation stretch, your iron cross, your sleeper stretch, and your lat stretch. 5 stretches that you can be doing on a daily basis. Hold each stretch for 30 seconds and repeat 1 or 2 times. Generally speaking, the evidence will show 1 minute of stretch time up to 2 minutes is where the magic happens. Anything less than a minute is insufficient. Anything more than 2 minutes has not been shown to be as effective. So you get a law of diminishing returns with that. Do these stretches a few times a week. Keep those hips, back, and shoulders healthy.